Hi, Andres from bioAquatiX. I'm going to talk about shrimp today, Neocardinias. That's pretty much what I'm breeding. Comes in many different colors. Originated from Taiwan, the original stocks, Southeast Asia overall. So it's kind of a new animal. In the last few years, it's been very popular for the nano tanks, the small little aquariums, and fish bowls, and small little cube tanks, or things like that. They're not hard to take care of. But there's a few things that are important to remember with the shrimp. Is that they like any other animal, stable condition. They don't do well with ammonia. But one of the main parameters that's tricky for them is carbonates. So if you're familiar with KH, if you measure KH, not JH, not general hardness, but carbonate hardness, you want the shrimp to have low carbonate hardness. It's kind of a little weird because you would think that it would need the carbonates to create shell, but it doesn't need the carbonates really. It's actually it doesn't do well with the carbonates, because the problem with the carbonates in the water, if they're too high, the shrimp has a difficulty molting, so they tend to die because they can't molt. So it's one of those little tricky thing. But if you keep the KH around 6 or 7 grains, then you're doing well. That's about what they like, But if you start going higher and at 15 and 20, they don't do too well. I mean, they'll do okay. Sometimes you'll have colonies that do well, but overall, this gets a little tricky. Their survival is not very good. But those are things that I think the hobbyists will figure out with their own shrimp. Every tank is a little different. Every animal adapts differently, So. But overall, that's one of the main things. But the most important thing with the shrimp is that they need literally an old tank, a seeded tank, an established tank to do well, because they really feed on the detritus that are in the tank and the biofilm that's in the tank, or whatever organic is in the tank. That's when they do well. When you put them in a new tank that has been completely scrubbed and you just started, a sponge filter or a filter system, it doesn't. They don't do very well. They don't adapt to the transition. It's because they like to eat. They're continuously foraging. It's an animal that is continuously, literally foraging all day long. And even at night, they'll forage most of the night. I mean, they do rest and things like that, for sure. But they need to forage. So in order for a little animal like that to satisfy his nutritional requirement, it's continuously eating. It's a very fast metabolism animal. It reproduces in 3 to 4 months, so it's a quick turnover. So they grow quick, but they need a supply of food. So the best food for them is definitely the old seeded tank, or the old tank, the established tank. That's a very good start, and then you definitely supplement with food and prepared food and things like that. But it's kind of one of those combinations. It needs both. It doesn't do very well in brand new tanks. So it needs an old tank. And then when that's set up, that does really well. One more thing something that I've experienced over the years is the age of the shrimp and shipping. For some reason, shipping large shrimp, fully mature, especially females full of eggs, is very tricky. For some reason, the females, especially females, they don't really adapt really well in the shipping. And the transition from one water where they come from to a new water in another one fish tanks. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's because the eggs have osmosis and they can't compensate for the new water, and then the female don't do well. But overall, I've had not very lot of success shipping fully grown breeders. So the best shipping I've done on little fish, little shrimp, is basically the young ones, the 2 or 3 month old, not the big 6 months. And the small ones tend to adapt really well. The medium-sized ones tend to adapt really well to the shipping, to a new environment. So that's something that I've noticed over the years. So, I mean, it might be different for other people, but that's one of my observation over the last 7 years of playing with shrimp. I'm going on 8 years. So I've been doing these shrimp for 8 years now. The other thing they also need is they need places to hang on, to attach themselves to it, that it's the substrate at the bottom or the side of the tank, or plants or branches or any kind of material they can cling onto. That's when they're most comfortable. And so it's a little different than fish. Fish are volume. They need volume, so that it's a three-dimensional area. So it's what they call a lateral growth and vertical growth. That would be for fish. But when you're doing shrimp, it's literally lateral growth only. So it's basically surface. So even though your tank can be really high, shrimp do well if they have places to hang on. So surface area. So plants, branches, rocks, anywhere they can hang on to. But overall, it's not a hard animal to breed. A couple of constraints on breeding is that you continuously have to cull them. Right? You continuously have to come up with working on your reds, working on your yellows or your oranges or whatever strain you're working on, because they literally throw many varieties of colors, and they revert back to wild very quickly if you don't stay on top of them, pulling the colors that you don't want and keeping the desired trait that you're looking for. And it makes it a really interesting fish in the hobby, because of its fast turnover, you can really work the colors. And it's very difficult when you're working on a fish that 2 or 3, 4 years before they get a sexually mature fish. It's really hard to do genetical work with it, trying to select colors that you're looking for in traits, because the turnover is so slow. But when you have an animal like shrimp or guppies, you could, within a few months, you start having a new generation and keep culling the strain that you want, or the finnage, or the colors that you're interested in. It makes it fun. So it's a very dynamic animal. So it's very interesting for the hobby, or the hobbyist, because they can really work quickly on developing a new color or maintaining their colors, because they're continuously growing and breeding quickly. So within 4 to 5 months, they're already breeding. And so it's a quick turnover. So when you got them breeding, you continuously have new sets of colors you can work with. So that's one of the things that's hard when you're farming that animal. So you continuously have to really get on top of them and keep the colors that you're looking. And so it's a lot of labor. It's labor intensive. It's colorful. It does really well in the small tanks, 1 gallon tank, even little bowls and things like that. So it does well with that. So it's a very intriguing animal. So it is a small fish, a small animal. So the problem is when you put it in a big tank, like a big 100-gallon tank, they tend to get lost in there. So you have to kneel over and look in the tank just to see the shrimp. But when you put them in small tanks, little desktop tanks or nano tanks, then they're really nice because you can see them right away. So it's kind of one of those new animals right now that's being really popular, and there's not a lot of us in the U.S. that breed them right now commercially. A lot of hobbyists do. The animal itself is not hard to breed. It just needs clean water, an old seeded tank, surface area, and temperature. It's a very wide temperature. It could breed at like 70 degrees all the way up to close to 90. The pH can be between 6.5 and 8.5 and does well. So it's got a broad range. The Neocardinas have a really broad range. The only parameter to check is basically the carbonate hardness. You want to get that a little lower. It's not very difficult, but that's one of the only parameters to check on. Other than that, it'll eat pretty much anything. It does well in every size tank you can think of. But there's one more thing that's interesting with the shrimp is sometimes they call them a chameleon shrimp, because they tend to change color a little bit depending on their environment. So I've noticed over the years that if I try to do a cherry shrimp in a white sand tank, they don't get as bright, they don't get as red. But if I put them in a tank that's got a black sand or black gravel, then they get really red. So little things like that make it interesting to work with. So it's not totally a chameleon, but the intensity of the color depends a lot on the environment. Of course, the genetics has something to do with it, but if you have to make the shrimp comfortable, and I think that shrimp do well with a darker substrate, because then they feel more safe. It's not so much the color as the feeling of them being comfortable. So they like to be on a dark branch or a plant, a nice and green plant. So everything's got to be a little darker. So when you have a white substrate, it doesn't feel, they don't see too comfortable, so they don't get as bright. They still get colored, but not as bright. So even the yellow shrimp does better for me in a dark substrate tank in terms of brightness than if I had it in a tank that was really bright and white sand. So those are little parameters and things that I keep an eye on to make sure the shrimp that I'm producing have good colors. You know, they do well with light, bright sunlight. They do well with some fish. As long as the fish aren't too big and like cichlids or things like that, they do well. They do well with a lot of the nanofish, a lot of the tetras, a lot of the little rasboras, some of the pygmy rainbows, corridoras, plecos, so small plecos, and even some catfish. But if you put a lot of fish like corridoras in the bottom of a tank, it may not do so well because they're continuously making a shrimp move.